They told the story so smoothly that even I, who had stood in that yard, almost believed it. The boy fell. The stable hand was careless. The strap was loose, the horse startled, and Prince Torin came down against the mounting block and broke his arm. A simple thing. A sad thing. Nobody's fault but a servant's, and the servant was already being led away before the physician had finished his splint. My name is Serell Vane, and for 11 years I kept the eastern posts of Harrogate as a guardsman of the king's household. I have watched a great many things happen inside those walls that were meant not to be watched. It is the strange nature of my trade, to be present and to be, at the same time, furniture. Men speak in front of a guard the way they speak in front of a door. They forget you have ears. They forget, most of all, that you have a memory, and that a memory kept still for long enough becomes a kind of ledger. I want to set down here, honestly, what happened on the day Prince Torin broke his arm, and in the weeks after, when a lie was built over the truth, the way stone is laid over a spring, carefully, deliberately, to keep the water from ever coming up. I want to set it down because a boy was called a liar, and a good man was called careless, and both of those things were false, and I had a part in making them true again. It began in the lower training yard, on a gray autumn morning that smelled of wet straw and cold iron. Prince Torin was 11 that year, old enough to be given a real seat and a real mount, young enough that his mother still watched from the gallery whenever he rode. He was not a reckless boy. That is the first thing I must say plainly, because the story that came after leaned entirely on the idea that he was. Torin was careful in the way that clever children are careful, the ones who have already learned that the world does not forgive them their mistakes as easily as it forgives other people's. He checked his own girth strap. He counted his own paces. He was the sort of 11-year-old who, when a groom told him to do a thing, would do it and then quietly do it again to be sure. That morning he was to practice mounting and dismounting from the training apparatus. The wooden horse, we called it, though it was more properly a vaulting frame. A padded barrel of a body on 4 fixed legs, with a real saddle strapped to it and a set of iron stirrups, built so that a child could learn the balance of the seat without a living animal shifting beneath him. It stood in the covered end of the yard, out of the weather. It had stood there for years. I had seen a dozen small royals learn on it. It was, everyone believed, the safest thing in Harrogate, a horse that could not bolt, could not rear, could not do anything at all but hold still and be climbed. I was posted at the yard gate that morning, which is why I saw it, and why I did not see it clearly enough. That is the truth of witnessing. You are only ever looking at one part of a thing. Torin came down at the 8th hour with Odo the stable hand beside him. Odo was a broad, slow, gentle man of perhaps 40, who had worked the Harrogate stables since before I took my oath. He had hands like bread loaves, and a way of talking to horses under his breath that I have never heard another man match. Children loved him because he was never impatient with them, and animals loved him because he was never afraid. He carried Torin's practice gloves and a soft brush, and he was telling the boy some slow story about a mare who had once eaten a whole apple tart off a windowsill, and Torin was laughing. That is the picture I keep. A big kind man and a laughing boy, walking into a covered yard on an ordinary morning. Nothing in it warned me. Odo helped Torin up onto the wooden horse. He checked the girth, I saw him check it, saw those big hands run under the strap and pull, saw him nod to himself the way careful men do. The boy settled into the seat. Odo stepped back to give him room, and Torin rose in the stirrups the way he had been taught, up out of the saddle to feel the balance of standing, arms a little out for. There was a crack. Not a loud crack. That is a thing people got wrong afterward when the story grew. They imagined some great splintering. It was not that. It was a short, dry snap, the sound a dead branch makes, and then the whole near side of the frame dropped 6 inches, no more, as one of the 4 fixed legs simply folded under the weight. The wooden horse lurched. Torin, half standing, had nothing to hold. He went sideways off the collapsing frame and came down against the stone edge of the mounting block, and I heard him cry out and I was already running. Odo reached him first. Of course he did, he was 3 feet away. When I got there, the big man had gathered the boy up against his chest and was saying his name over and over. Torin, Torin, easy now, easy. I've got you. And Torin was white and shaking and holding his left arm against his body in the particular way that tells you, before any physician does, that a bone has gone. I want to be precise about what I saw because everything turned on it later. I saw the wooden horse leaning drunkenly on its collapsed leg. I saw the leg itself, the timber post that had folded lying at an angle no sound timber makes. And I saw on the broken end of it where the wood had given way a darkness. Not the pale, clean face of fresh broken pine. A darkness. The stain of old wet. Rot. That leg had not snapped because a boy stood up in the stirrups. That leg had been dying from the inside for a long time, and it had chosen that morning, under that particular child, to finally let go. I saw it for perhaps 3 seconds. Then the physician's people were pouring into the yard, and the Queen Consort's steward was there shouting for the boy to be lifted, and I was ordered back to the gate to hold the crowd, and I did what a guardsman does. I obeyed. I held the gate. I let the moment be taken out of my hands. By evening, the leg had been carried away for firewood. By the next morning, the story was already made. I heard it first from another guardsman, Halden, who had it from a chamber groom, who had it from the Queen Consort's own steward, that the accident had come of a loose girth strap, carelessly fastened, that the stable hand Odo had grown slack in his years, that the boy had been thrown when the saddle slipped, and had struck his head, mind you, not the mounting block edge his arm had taken, and that it was a mercy it had been no worse. Odo, the story went, was being questioned. It was likely he would be dismissed. A man could not be trusted with the king's grandsons, who could not be trusted with a buckle. I remember standing very still while Halden told me this, the way I stand at post, and feeling something go cold and level inside me. Because I had watched Odo check that girth. I had watched those big careful hands run the strap and pull it and nod. The girth had not slipped. There had been no slipped saddle, no thrown boy, no blow to the head. There had been a rotten leg that folded and a child who fell against stone, and it had had nothing to do with the man who was now being led toward disgrace. A false story is not always a lie shouted loudly. More often it is a lie told softly, by people who would be very surprised to be called liars, each of them passing along the thing they were given as though it were simply the known shape of the world. That is what makes it so hard to pull down. There is no single throat to name. There is only the smooth, agreed-upon surface and everyone standing on it, and beneath it the truth like water pressing up, finding no crack. I did not go to anyone that first day. I want to be honest about that too. I was a guardsman. My duty was my post, my orders came down a chain, and it was not my place to walk into the physician's wing and announce that the king's steward had the story wrong. A guard who does that once is a guard who is not trusted again, and a guard who is not trusted is given nothing, sees nothing, is worth nothing to anyone he might later want to help. I had learned in 11 years that the man who wants to change a thing inside a palace must first be patient enough to keep his place while he learns how. So I kept my place. But I began, quietly, to keep my ledger. The first entry was the leg. I had seen rot on the broken end. That was fact, my own eyes, and I set it down in my memory in the careful hand I use for things I mean to keep. The second entry was Odo's hands on the girth. Fact, my own eyes. The third was the story as Halden gave it, the slipped saddle, the blow to the head, and beside it I set a mark, the mark I use for a thing that does not fit the facts I trust. A story that describes an accident that did not happen the way I watched it happen. 2 truths and a lie. That was all I had that first evening. It was not enough to save a good man, but it was a beginning, and I have learned that beginnings, kept honestly, have a way of growing. I should tell you something about Harrogate as it was in those years, because you cannot understand what came after without it. The king, Alaric, was old and honorable and tired. He had loved his first wife, the Queen Isolde, past all reason, and when she died something in him had gone dim, and into that dimness had come his second wife, the Queen Consort Morwenna, a handsome, cold, tireless woman who had married a grief and set about, patiently, turning it into an estate. She had a grown son from a former marriage, Lord Cassius, a smooth and hungry man who wore his stepfather's household like a coat he intended to keep, and a daughter, Lady Verena, who watched everything and said little. Around these three the court had slowly rearranged itself, the way iron filings arrange around a magnet, and a man who wished to prosper at Harrogate had learned to bend, at least a little, toward the consort's weather. Against them stood the Crown Prince, Rowan, Isolde's son, the true heir, honorable as his father had been before grief unstrung him, and sharper. Rowan saw the consort clearly. He did not trust her, and she did not trust him, and between them lay a long, cold contest for the soul of the household that everyone felt and no one named. Rowan's wife, the Princess Alara, was gentle and beloved, and their 3 children, Malin, who was 9 and quick, Torin, who was 11 and careful, and little Bram, who was 6 and afraid of nothing, were the brightest thing in that grey palace, and the thing over which, more than any jewel or acre, the 2 courts silently fought. For the children were Rowan's, and Rowan's children were the future, and the future was the one estate the consort could not simply seize. I tell you this so you understand. When Prince Torin fell, and a story was made that the fall had come of servants' carelessness rather than of a rotten frame no one had maintained, the making of that story was not idle. Someone was responsible for that training apparatus. Someone had let it rot. And in a household where a rotten palace beam or a rotten palace habit could be pointed at like a blade, the difference between an old frame failed and a careless servant failed was not a small difference at all. One of them led back, if you followed it, into the household's own neglect. The other led to a stable hand who could be dismissed and forgotten and made into the whole of the matter. I did not understand all of this on that first gray evening. I understood only that a good man was being blamed for a thing I had watched not happen, and that the truth of it lay in a rotten timber that was, even then, being fed to a fire. But some fires burn slowly, and some men remember. They kept Torin abed for the first week, his arm bound and splinted, and the household arranged itself around his convalescence the way households do, with soup and hush, and a great many visitors who came to be seen visiting. I was moved from the yard gate to the inner corridor of the family wing during those days, part of the augmented watch set on the injured prince. It was, I understood later, no accident that I was moved. A guardsman who has seen a thing is best kept somewhere he can be observed, where his silence can be counted and his usefulness measured. But at the time it seemed only a rotation of duty, and it gave me something I would not otherwise have had: proximity. I stood outside Torin's door hour upon hour, and I heard things. I heard the physician, a dry and honest old man named Master Corvin, tell the Crown Prince Rowan that the break was clean and would knit well, that the boy had been fortunate, and that, here his voice dropped, but a guardsman's ears are trained to what drops, that the injury was, in his professional view, not consistent with a fall from a slipped saddle. A slipped saddle throws a rider outward and down. The boy's arm had taken a direct edge strike, the kind you get from falling against something at close range. Corvin did not press the point. He was a physician, not an investigator, and he had learned, like all of us, where the walls of his usefulness stood. But he had said it, and Rowan had heard it, and I filed it in my ledger beside the rot on the leg. The physician does not believe the story either. I heard, too, the visits of the other court. The Queen Consort came twice, and both times she came with a great show of tenderness and a small, cold efficiency underneath it. She sat by the boy and stroked his hair and spoke, in that carrying voice of hers that was always meant for the room and not the child, about how careless the stables had grown, how she had warned that the old servants were past their work, how fortunate it was that dear Torin's spirit was so strong. She was, I realized, standing at that door with my face forward and my ears open, not comforting the boy at all. She was rehearsing the story, saying it aloud in the sick room over the child's own body, so that it would harden into the accepted thing, so that Torin himself, half drugged with the physician's poppy and aching and small, would come to hear his own accident described in her words until he half believed them. And Torin, this is the part I have never forgotten, Torin said on the second visit in a thin, flat voice. It wasn't Odo. The leg broke. I felt it break under me first. There was a small silence in that room. I could not see it, but I could feel it through the door the way you feel weather change. You struck your head, my darling, the consort said, gently, terribly. The physician says so. You're confused. It's quite natural. Rest now and don't trouble yourself trying to remember. It does no good to remember these things wrongly. Don't trouble yourself trying to remember. I have heard many orders given in my years at Harrogate, some of them cruel, but I am not sure I ever heard a colder one than that, a grown woman at the bedside of a hurt child, instructing him not to trust his own memory of his own pain, because his memory was inconvenient. A child of 11, told by his king's own wife that the thing he had felt happen to his own body had not happened. That is how a false story does its deepest work, not by silencing you, but by teaching you to doubt yourself. I said it in my ledger. The boy remembers the leg. He is being taught to forget it. Now I must tell you about Odo, because while all this was happening in the warm upper rooms, the big, gentle stable hand was sitting in a cold cell beneath the gatehouse, and the story was hardening around him too. He had not been formally charged with anything, because there was nothing to charge. No law is broken by an accident. But he had been detained pending the household's inquiry, which is the palace's way of imprisoning a man without the inconvenience of a crime, and the household's inquiry was a thing entirely in the consort steward's hands. I contrived, on the third day, to draw a watch shift at the gatehouse, and I went down to the cells on the excuse of the ordinary rounds, and I stopped at Odo's door. He looked up at me with those slow, patient eyes, and he was not angry. That was the thing that struck me and has stayed with me. A man wrongly caged has every right to fury, and Odo had none. He only looked tired and bewildered, like a big animal that has been struck by someone it trusted and cannot understand why. Serell, he said, they tell me the boy is mending. He is, I said, clean break. He'll be riding again by spring. Odo nodded slowly and something eased in his big shoulders, and I understood that he had been sitting there for 3 days more afraid for the child than for himself. Good, he said, good, that's the main thing. And then, quietly, they're saying I let the girth go slack. That I didn't check it. He looked at his own hands, the great careful loaf hands, turning them over. I've fastened 10,000 girths, Serell. I checked that one. I always check. But they don't ask me. Nobody's asked me what happened. They just decided. I know, I said. He looked up sharply at that. You know. I should not have said it. A guardsman does not tell a detained man that he doubts the household story. It is very near to sedition, and if it had been carried back up the chain it would have ended me. But I looked at that broken, bewildered good man, and I could not make myself lie to him the way everyone above him was lying. I was at the gate, I said low. I saw the leg fold. I saw the rod on the brake. The girth had nothing to do with it, Odo. You checked it. I watched you check it. I paused. I'm not going to say that where it can be heard, not yet, but I'm not going to forget it either. You have that from me. For a moment the big man could not speak. Then he reached one hand through the bars, not to grasp mine. He was too dignified for that, but simply to lay it, for a second, against the cold iron near where my hand rested. It is the only time in my life a prisoner has thanked me for doing nothing at all. Whatever you can, he said. Whatever you can and no more. I won't have you ruined for me. There's been enough ruin. I left the cells with something settled in me that had not been settled before. Up to that hour I had been a witness, keeping a private ledger for my own conscience's sake. From that hour I was something else. I had made a man a promise, and a promise is a debt, and I have never in my life let a debt stand unpaid. The question was how. I was one guardsman. The story I meant to pull down had been made by the consort's household and accepted in its silence by the king's, and its one piece of hard evidence, the rotten leg, had been burned. What I had was memory, and memory in a court is the weakest coin there is. Anyone can be made to doubt what he remembers. The consort had just proven that on a child. So I would need more than memory. I would need the thing memory could not give me, the record of the frame itself, where it came from, who had built it and who had kept it, and this was the hinge, though I did not yet know how central it would prove who had last worked on it. Because a leg does not rot cleanly through in a single season. Rot like that takes years, and a well-kept apparatus, inspected and oiled and retimbered as it should be, does not carry years of rot in a load-bearing leg. Somebody had failed to keep that frame, and somebody, faced with a soft and failing leg, might have done worse than fail to replace it, might have patched it, might have made it asterisk look asterisk sound while leaving it rotten underneath, the cheap repair, the hidden fault, the thing that holds until the day it doesn't. If that were so, then Odo was not merely a convenient scapegoat. He was a curtain. He was being hung in front of the real fault so that no one would look behind him, and the person who had hung him there was the person who had something to hide behind. I did not yet know who that was, but I knew now exactly what I was looking for. Harrogate keeps records the way old houses keep dust, everywhere in layers and mostly forgotten. There is a clerk of works who maintains the ledgers of every repair and every purchase for the palace grounds, every cartload of timber, every mason's fee, every new hinge on every gate. If the training frame had ever been repaired, there would be a line for it somewhere in those ledgers, in some clerk's cramped hand, with a date and a cost and a name. The clerk of works was a nervous, ink-stained man named Petrel, who guarded his ledgers the way some men guard gold, less from greed than from the terror of being found to have made an error in them. I had no authority to demand a sight of them. A guardsman's writ does not run to the counting-house, so I did not demand. I did what patient men do. I made myself useful and I waited. It happened that Petrel's counting-house had, that autumn, a leaking window and a broken latch, and it happened that a guardsman with a steady hand and a little skill in carpentry, which I had, my father having been a joiner before I ever took an oath, could be lent to such small tasks in the quiet hours between watches. I asked my sergeant for the duty. He thought me odd for wanting it and gave it to me gladly, as men will give away the tasks they consider beneath them. So for 3 evenings I mended Petrel's window while Petrel worked at his ledgers, and I talked to him the way you talk to a nervous man, slowly, about nothing, letting the silences be comfortable. I admired his hand. I asked, idly, how many years of the household's work were kept in those great bound books, and he warmed to it as men warm to their own competence and told me, everything for 40 years, every nail. I said it must be a great labor to keep it all straight, and he agreed that it was, and grew warmer still. And on the 3rd evening, mending the latch with my back to him, I said, as if it had only just occurred to me, terrible business, the young prince's fall. In the old training frame, was it? I'd have thought a thing like that was kept sound. Petrel's pen stopped scratching. I did not turn around. I have learned that a man will say a great deal more to your back than to your face. After a moment his pen started again, but slower, and he said, in a careful voice quite unlike his warm one, it was kept sound. There's a line for it. It was seen to only this spring, new braced, all 4 legs. It's in the book. I entered it myself. A pause. So whatever failed, it wasn't the keeping of it. The book's quite clear. Now, a nervous man tells you a thing is in the book and offers, unasked, that he entered it himself, and insists the book is quite clear. That man is not reassuring you. That man is reassuring himself. He is a man who has been made afraid of his own ledger. Of course, I said easily, tightening the last screw, these things happen to the best-kept gear. Wood's wood. And I let it go, and we talked of other things, and I finished the latch and thanked him and left. But I had 2 new entries for my ledger, and they were the most important yet. The first, the frame had a repair line dated that spring, new braced all 4 legs. The second, and larger, Petrol was frightened of that line, which meant the line was not what it seemed. A true, ordinary repair does not frighten the clerk who recorded it. Only a false one does, a repair paid for and entered but not truly done, or done cheaply and cruelly. The record made honest looking to cover a thing that was not honest at all. Somebody had been paid that spring to rebrace all 4 legs of the training frame. The money had left the household's accounts. The line was in the book, and one of those 4 legs had, 6 months later, rotted through and folded under a child. Either the work had never been done, and the money had gone into somebody's pocket, and the record was a lie to cover a theft, or the work had been done so badly, so cheaply, that a rotten leg had been braced over rather than replaced, made to look sound while the rot went on eating it from within. Either way, the fault lay not in the stables and not in a stable hand's buckle, but in that spring's repair, and in whoever had ordered it, taken the coin for it, and signed it done. I needed the name in that line. And that name, Petrol would never simply give me. I want to pause here and tell you what these weeks were like, because it was not, whatever the tidiness of my telling might suggest, a clean straight line from a rotten leg to the truth. It was slow, and it was frightening, and there were long stretches when I thought I would never get past the surface of the thing at all. I stood my watches. I mended my window. I went down when I could to Odo's cell, and each time he was a little thinner and a little quieter, and the household's inquiry ground on with no end in sight, which was itself the punishment, to hold a man in the cold indefinitely, uncharged and uncleared, until his life outside had crumbled and his spirit with it. Twice I heard the consort's steward remark, in the careless way powerful men's servants have, that the stable hand would likely be let go quietly once the boy is up and about, no sense making a great matter of it, which told me the whole design. They did not even want a trial. A trial has evidence in it and questions and the risk of the truth. They wanted the thing to simply fade, the boy healed, the servant gone, the story settled by everyone's agreement to stop looking. Odo was not to be punished so much as erased. And the boy himself was fading in a different way. I stood at his door as his arm mended, and I watched, through the once-a-day glimpses my post allowed me, a careful bright child grow quiet and uncertain. He had said in the first days the leg broke. I felt it break. By the 3rd week he said it no longer. The consort's patient repetition had done its work. He had been told so many times, so gently, that he was confused, that he had struck his head, that he must not trouble himself to remember, that he had begun to believe he could not trust the one true thing he knew. I heard him once tell his little sister Malin in the flat, careful voice of a child reciting a lesson, that he wasn't sure what happened really, it all went so fast. And Malin, who was 9 and quick and loved her brother, said, "But you told me. You said the horse frame broke," and Torin said, "I don't know. I might have got it wrong." And there was such a small defeat in it that I had to look hard down the corridor and swallow before I trusted my own face again. That more than anything hardened me. It is one thing to disgrace a servant. It is another thing to reach into a child and quietly unmake his faith in his own true memory, so that he will grow up carrying a false story about his own body and call it his fault and never know he was robbed. I decided at that boy's door that whatever it cost me, the truth would come up. Not for Odo alone now, for Torin. A child is owed the truth of his own life. But deciding is not doing, and I still had no name. The name, when I finally reached it, did not come from Petrol's ledger at all. It came from the frame itself, or rather, from the one part of the frame that had not been burned. I had assumed all this while that the evidence was gone. The rotten leg had been carried off for firewood on the first evening. I had watched it go. But a training frame has 4 legs, and only one had folded, and it had never occurred to me, until, standing my dull watch one gray afternoon, it suddenly did to ask what had become of the other three. The frame had not been discarded. That was the thing. A costly piece of household gear is not thrown away because one leg fails. It is set aside to be mended or broken down for parts. I made inquiries casual, a guardsman's idle curiosity, and learned that the wooden horse, minus its firewood leg, had been dragged into the old tack store at the far end of the lower yard, and stood in a corner among the broken harness and the disused saddles, waiting for somebody to decide whether it was worth repairing. It had been sitting there, forgotten, for weeks. I went to see it on my next free hour, with a lantern alone. It stood in the dark of the tack store like a sad dead animal, canted over on its three remaining legs where the fourth had been. I set my lantern on a barrel-head and I looked at those three legs, one after another, close, running my joiner's hands over them the way my father had taught me to read timber. And what I found stopped my breath. All three remaining legs bore the marks of the spring's repair. I could see where iron bracing straps had been fitted around each, the new bracing that Petrel's ledger recorded, the work the household had paid good coin for. But when I looked asterisk under the straps and pressed, and put my ear close and tapped the way you tap a beam to hear whether it is sound or hollow, two of the three legs answered dead. Soft. The dull, thudless note of wood gone punky with rot beneath a bright skin of paint, and an iron strap bolted over the worst of it to hold it together a while longer. The bracing had not repaired the legs. The bracing had asterisk hidden them. Somebody that spring had found the frame's legs rotting, probably all four, the fourth simply the furthest gone, and instead of doing the true expensive work of replacing the timber, had done the cheap wicked thing. Strapped iron over the rot to make it look mended, painted over the softness, and entered the job in the ledger as asterisk new braced, all four legs sound. Paid in full. Signed done. A child's safety sold for the difference between an honest repair and a fraudulent one. And here at last was the thing that would break the false story open, because a fraud, unlike an accident, has a paper trail and a purse and a name. Somebody had ordered this work. Somebody had taken the coin and done it falsely. And somebody in the household had approved the payment and signed the ledger line. Three people, perhaps, or two, or one wearing several hats. And every one of them had, from the moment that leg folded under Prince Torin, the strongest possible reason to want the whole matter buried under a stable hand's buckle and never, ever examined. I knelt there in the tack store with my hand on the dead soft timber, and I understood, finally and fully, what I was standing inside of. Not an accident with a wrongly blamed servant. A cover-up of a fraud, in which the wrongly blamed servant was the deliberate lid. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the guardsman's dormitory listening to Haldon snore, and I turned the thing over and over. I had now real evidence, the two dead legs, still standing in the tack store, that any honest carpenter could tap and confirm. But evidence in a court is not the same as evidence in a barn. I was a guardsman. If I went up the chain with this, to my sergeant, to the captain of the guard, it would go, as everything went, through the household stewards, which meant through the consort's people, which meant it would reach the very hands with the most reason to make it disappear. The legs would be quietly carried off to the same fire that took the fourth. Petrel's ledger would suffer some clerical mishap, and I would be marked as a guardsman who invented conspiracies and moved to some cold far post and made harmless. There was only one man in Harrogate to whom I could take this, who both wanted the truth and had the power to protect it, the Crown Prince Rowan, Torin's own father. But you do not simply walk up to the Crown Prince. Between a common guardsman and the heir stand 100 doors and 100 stewards, half of them the consorts, and any message I sent would be read before it reached him, and any request for audience would be reported. I could not ask to see him. I would have to find a way to be seen by him, alone, with the thing in my hands, and to do it without a single one of the wrong people knowing it had happened. I began to watch for my chance, and while I watched, the ground shifted under me, because the other side was not idle either. The first sign that I had been noticed came 3 days after my night in the tack store. I went on my free hour to look at the frame again, to be sure of it, to check the 2 dead legs once more before I risked everything on them. And the frame was gone. The tack store corner where it had stood held only a pale rectangle in the dust and a few scattered iron bolts. In the days since I had knelt there with my lantern, someone had come and taken the wooden horse away. When I asked, carefully, idly, the yardmaster told me with a shrug that the old training frame had finally been broken up for firewood on the steward's order. No sense storing rubbish. Broken up for firewood, all 4 legs now, on the steward's order. In the 3 days since I, a guardsman with no authority and no known interest, had gone alone with a lantern to examine it. I stood very still in that dusty corner, and I felt the cold come up my spine, because it told me 2 things at once, and both were bad. It told me that my evidence, the hard physical proof that would have let any honest carpenter confirm the fraud, was ash. And it told me that someone had known I was looking. Someone had followed the thread of my quiet questions, or watched me go to the tack store, and had moved to burn the evidence out from under me before I could use it. I was not investigating in secret. I had been seen, and whoever had seen me was a step ahead. I will not pretend I was not afraid. A guardsman who becomes inconvenient inside a palace does not, as a rule, come to a dramatic end. He simply comes to a small one, a posting to a border tower, a quiet dismissal for some invented lapse, an accusation of drink, of theft, of insubordination, easily made and impossible to disprove. I had seen it done to better men than me, and I now had hanging over me people with every reason to do it and the knowledge that I was a threat. For one long night I considered stopping. I want to be honest about that, because the men who tell these stories always leave out the night they nearly quit, and it is a lie of omission that makes courage look easier than it is. I lay awake and I told myself that the evidence was gone, that memory was worthless, that I had a promise to Odo but no way to keep it, that a wise man knows when a thing cannot be done and saves himself for a fight he can win. I told myself all of it, and it was all reasonable, and I nearly believed it. And then I thought of Torin saying I might have got it wrong in that small, defeated voice, and I thought of Odo's hand laid against the cold iron, and I thought, a thing my father used to say over his workbench, that a fault covered over does not go away. It only waits in the dark under the paint for the next weight to come down on it. The rot had been braced over once already, and a child had fallen. If I braced over it too, with my silence, then I was no better than the man who painted the leg. The next weight would come down on someone else. It always does. So I did not stop, but I changed how I fought. The physical evidence was gone. I could not get it back. But evidence is not only timber. There was still the ledger, Petrel's frightened ledger with its false line, and Petrel himself, who was a frightened man, and frightened men, handled rightly, are the seams through which the truth escapes. And there was the money. A fraud has a purse. The coin paid out for that false repair had gone into someone's hands, and money in a well-kept household leaves a longer trail than timber. If I could not prove the rot, I could perhaps prove the theft, and the theft would lead to the same names, and the names would break the whole story open. I turned back to Petrel. I did not go at him directly. A frightened man, cornered, either lies or collapses, and a collapse in the wrong room only warns the enemy. I went at him sideways, and I went at him with a truth of my own, because I had learned that the only thing that reliably moves a frightened man is a fear larger than the one already holding him. I found him alone in the counting-house one evening. I still had the standing excuse of the mended window, which I now, in a small irony, unmended slightly so as to have reason to return, and I did not talk of nothing this time. I sat down across from him, and I let the silence be uncomfortable rather than easy, and after a while I said, quietly, "Petrel, I've been to see the training frame. I looked at the legs before they were burned. 2 of them were rotten through under the bracing. The repair that's entered in your book was never truly done. I let that sit. I'm not telling you this to threaten you. I'm telling you because I think you already know it, and I think it's been sitting on you like a stone since the boy fell, and I think you're a decent man who's very frightened. Petrol had gone white to the lips. His hands on the ledger were shaking. For a long moment I thought he would order me out, or shout for help, or simply deny it all. Instead, to my surprise, his eyes filled. "I only recorded it," he whispered. "That's all I did. The work order came to me signed and approved. The coin was drawn against it. My task is to enter what I'm given, not to go out and tap every beam in the palace with a hammer. When the money's approved above me, I record it. That's the whole of my office. That's all I did." He was pleading now, but not with me, with himself, with the ledger, with whatever he lay awake bargaining with. And then the boy fell, and I looked at the line, and I understood what it must mean, and I have been sick with it, Serell, sick, but what can I do? What can a clerk do? If I say one word, I lose my place, and worse. They'll say the false entry was mine, they'll say I took the coin, they'll make it my fraud to save the real one. A clerk is the easiest man in the world to hang a false line on, so I say nothing. I record what I'm given, and I don't sleep. Here it was, the whole ugly machinery of a cover-up, spoken aloud at last by the small, frightened man caught in its gears. Everyone knew a piece. No one would say. Each of them had a fear that made silence the only safe path, and the sum of all their small silences was one large lie, standing over a child and a good man like a wall. "Then let me carry it," I said. "Not you. I'm not asking you to stand up in the hall and accuse anyone. I'm asking you one thing, and then I'll never trouble you again." I leaned forward. "The work order that came to you signed and approved. Who signed it? Who approved the coin?" Petrol looked at me for a long, long moment. And then, because a frightened man who is offered a way to be brave without being destroyed will nearly always take it, he opened the great ledger to a page he did not need to search for. He knew exactly where it was. He had visited it in his sleep, and he turned it around, and he set his shaking finger on a line. "The work order for the spring repair of the royal training apparatus. Timber, iron, and labor. A sum of coin. And beside it the mark of authorization, the name of the household officer who had ordered the work, taken charge of the coin, and signed the job complete. Lord Cassius, the Queen Consort's own son." I sat back slowly and looked at that name and understood, all at once, the whole shape of the thing. Lord Cassius had charge of a great many of the household's practical offices. The upkeep, the works, the accounts of the grounds. Offices his mother had steadily maneuvered into his hands over the years, ostensibly to give the idle young lord useful employment, in truth to place the household's purse where the consort's family could reach it. And a man in charge of the works, if he were greedy and careless both, might do a very simple, very old kind of theft, approve a repair, draw the full honest coin for it, then have the work done cheaply or barely done at all and pocket the difference. It is the oldest fraud there is. It is why old houses fall down. And it works beautifully, for years, invisibly, until one day the corner cut happens to be a load-bearing leg, and the weight that comes down on it happens to be a prince. The rot in that frame was not a single wickedness. It was the accident that exposed a habit. Cassius had almost certainly been skimming the works accounts for a long time, false repair after false repair, and the training frame was simply the one that failed, the one that turned a hidden theft into a broken child. And the moment it failed, Cassius had faced ruin, because if anyone examined that frame closely, they would find the fraud, and the fraud led straight to him, and through him, to the shadow behind him. So the story of the careless stable hand had not been made out of idle cruelty. It had been made in terror. It was a man frantically nailing a servant over the hole in the floor before anyone could look down it, and see how far the rot went. And his mother, the Queen Consort, had put her whole cold weight behind that story, at the bedside over the boy's own body, teaching a child to doubt his own memory. Whether she knew the details of her son's theft or only knew that her son was in danger and must be shielded, I could not say. But she had chosen without hesitation to protect the guilty and unmake the innocent, because that is what she was, all the way down. I had it now, the whole chain, the rotten leg, the false repair, the skimmed coin, the frightened clerk, the signed line, the name. And the name reached higher than any name I had ever thought to touch. Which was exactly why it was so dangerous, because a common guardsman does not accuse the Queen Consort's son of fraud. A common guardsman who tries it is a dead man walking, not dead in body perhaps, but dead in every way that lets a man keep his living and his name. The moment I spoke that name aloud in any room the consort's people could reach, the counterstory would swing into place. That the disgruntled guardsman Serell Vane, overfamiliar with a detained servant, had invented a slander against a lord to save his stable-hand friend, and had perhaps been paid to do it, or was mad or drunk, and here, look, was some small manufactured proof of his own corruption. And I would be gone, and petrol with me, and the ledger would burn, and Odo would be quietly dismissed as planned, and the wall over the truth would stand higher than ever. I could not take this up the chain. I had known that before. Now I knew it doubly. My only path was still Rowan, and it was narrower than ever, because now the consort's people were watching me. My evidence was ash, and my one witness was a clerk who would shatter if he were ever put in a room with power. And then, just when I had settled to the long, patient work of finding my way to the Crown Prince, the ground gave way beneath me a second time, and this was the true setback, the one that nearly ended it all. They came for petrol 4 days later. It was done quietly, as these things are always done. A charge of embezzlement was laid against the clerk of works, that he had over some years falsified repair entries and pocketed the difference, and that the failed training frame was proof of it. A repair recorded but never done, the coin gone, a child hurt by his fraud. Petrol was arrested. His ledgers were seized as evidence and taken into the household's keeping, into the consort's steward's keeping. And the story that ran through Harrowgate within a day was a masterwork. I must grant them that. The mystery of the prince's fall was solved. Not a careless stable hand after all, but a corrupt clerk who had stolen the repair money and left the frame to rot. Justice would be done. The clerk would answer for it. And this was the exquisite cruelty of it. The stable hand Odo, cleared of the buckle he never loosened, would be quietly released, his name restored, everyone's mercy on display. Do you see the beauty of it? They had taken my own evidence and turned it into their shield. The false repair was real, the rotten leg was real, a fraud had been done, all true, and now all admitted. But they had cut the trail at petrol and hung the whole of it on him. The clerk who merely recorded the line was to be the man who committed it. Cassius's signature of authorization vanished into, the clerk falsified the entries. The consort's bedside work vanished into, a mother's natural distress. And by throwing Odo his freedom in the same breath, they made themselves the heroes of the story that cleared him, so that even the innocent man I was fighting for would be inclined to bless the very people who had framed his replacement. It was, I thought, standing stunned in the corridor as the news washed over me, the most complete defeat I could have suffered. My evidence was theirs now. My witness was in a cell, being fitted for the crime, terrified into whatever confession would spare him worse. My name, for I had been seen talking with both the clerk and the stable hand, could be woven into the fraud at their leisure. And the true thief walked the upper halls, safe, his mother's shadow over him, the whole matter tidily solved in a way that touched him not at all. That was the night I came closest to breaking. Not to quitting, I was past quitting. Odo's hand and Torin's small voice had put me past it, but to breaking, to walking up into the great hall and shouting the name Lord Cassius across the court in a fury, and being taken for a madman, and thrown down, and ending it all uselessly in a single night's rage. I stood in the dark of the lower corridor with my hands shaking and that fury climbing in me like water in a lock. And it was my father's voice, again, that held me. Not his workbench proverb this time, but the way he worked. My father was a joiner, and the thing about a joiner is that he never forces a joint. A joint forced is a joint that fails. You cut true and you fit true and you let the wood come together under its own weight and then it holds forever. Force nothing. Fit everything. Let it come together where it wants to come together, and when it does, it will hold. I had been trying to force the joint, to hurl the truth into the wrong room and make it stick by main strength, and the truth, forced, would have failed and been called a lie. So I stood in the dark and I made myself go cold and level again, the way I go at post. I asked myself not how do I strike, but where does this joint want to close? And I saw slowly that everything the enemy had done had one flaw in it, one place where the fitted truth could still slip through. They had, in solving the mystery, admitted the fraud. They had confessed publicly that the repair was false and the coin stolen. They had done that to hang it on petrol. But in doing it, they had made the fraud an official fact, no longer something I had to prove against the household's denial, but something the household itself had proclaimed. The only remaining question now was not asterisk was there a fraud but who signed the work order. And the answer to that question was in the seized ledger, the ledger they now held on a single line, in Cassius's own hand. They could burn the frame, they could jail the clerk, but they could not easily destroy their own seized evidence ledger without destroying the case they had just built against petrol, the very case that had made them heroes. They needed that ledger to convict the clerk, and that ledger held the line that damned the Lord. I did not need to bring evidence anymore. I only needed to bring the right eyes to the evidence they were themselves preserving. I needed to put the Crown Prince Rowan in front of that seized ledger, at the line petrol had shown me, and let him read the name for himself. The joint had shown me where it wanted to close. Now I had to fit it. Reaching the Crown Prince unseen took me 6 days and cost me more nerve than any watch I ever stood. I could send no message, it would be read. I could request no audience, it would be reported. I had to be where Rowan was, alone or nearly so, with reason to be there, and I had to give him, in the few seconds such a chance would last, enough to make him come to me rather than turn away. Because a single guardsman muttering about the consort's son would be dismissed as a lunatic if he could not, in one breath, make the air need asterisk to hear more. I studied Rowan's movements the way I had once studied a wall I meant to guard. He was a private man, grave since his mother, the late Queen, died, and there was one thing he did alone. Each morning before the household woke, he walked the old orchard walk on the eastern side of the grounds, the walk that had been his mother's, Queen Isolde's, favorite, and he walked it alone, having let it be known long ago that he wished no attendance there. It was the 1 hour of his day the consort's watchers did not fill, because it was the 1 hour that belonged to his grief, and even they had the sense to leave a man his grief. The eastern orchard walk ran at its far end, past the old wall where the eastern post stood. My posts, the posts I had kept for 11 years. So on the 7th morning I arranged, by a trade of duties with Haldon, to stand the dawn watch at the eastern wall. And when the Crown Prince came down the frost-silvered orchard walk alone in the gray light, I was where a guardsman had every right to be, at my post, saying nothing, asking nothing, drawing no eye. He would pass within 10 feet of me. It was the only 10 feet in all of Harrogate where I could speak to him with no one to hear. He came slowly, his breath smoking in the cold, his eyes on the bare trees, a man walking with the dead. He would have passed me as men pass guards without a glance. And I broke, for the first time in 11 years, the one law that had defined my whole service. I spoke at my post, unbidden, to a member of the royal house. Your Highness, low, barely more than the frost cracking, forgive me, do not stop and do not look at me, keep walking. But hear me. He did not stop. To his eternal credit, And it is the measure of the man. He understood at once that a guard who broke his silence like that, in that place at that hour, was not mad but desperate, and that the only mercy and the only wisdom was to keep walking and to listen. His pace did not change, but I saw the smallest tilt of his head. The clerk did not commit the fraud on the training frame, I said, to the cold air, to the trees, not to him. He recorded it. The work order for that repair was signed and approved by another hand, and that hand is in the ledger your household seized, on the line the clerk will hang for. I have seen the line myself. I have seen the rotten legs under the false bracing before they were burned. Prince Torin told the truth. The frame broke under him. The stable hand was innocent, and so is the clerk, and the name on that work order is the guilty one, and it is a name no message to you would survive, which is why I am at my post at dawn, breaking my oath to say it to the air near you and no other way. For 3 or 4 steps he said nothing, and the whole world hung on those steps. Then, without turning his head, in a voice as low and level as my own, "Whose name?" "I will not speak it here, Highness, even so quietly, but you can read it yourself in 1 minute without my word for anything. Have the seized ledger brought to you privately, to your own hand, not through any steward, and open it to the work order for the spring repair of the training apparatus. Read the mark of authorization. That is all I ask. Read it yourself. Then you will know why the true story was buried and by whom, and you will not need to trust a word from me." Rowan walked on 3 more steps. He was nearly past me now, and he said, so quietly I nearly lost it under the wind, "Your name, guardsman?" "Serell Vane, Highness, Eastern Posts, and your Highness, the stable hand Odo, who never loosened a buckle, and the clerk Petrel, who never stole a coin, are both to be quietly destroyed to keep this line unread. If nothing else, I beg you read the line before you let that happen." He passed me. He did not look back. He walked on down the frost-white orchard and was gone among the bare trees, and I stood at my post with my heart going like a drum, and no way at all to know whether I had just saved 2 innocent men or ended myself. For a full day I heard nothing. It was the longest day of my service. I stood my watches and waited to be arrested or dismissed or summoned, and none of it came, and the silence was worse than any of them. Then, on the 2nd evening, a page I did not know found me with a folded slip. It bore no seal and no name, only 3 words in a firm private hand. I read it. What Rowan did with what he read, he did in his own way, and I was not present for the heart of it. But I have pieced together from what I saw and what those who were there later told me, how the Crown Prince took action, and it was not the action the enemy expected, nor the action my own fury would have taken. It was a joiner's action. He did not force the joint. He fitted it, and then he brought the weight down all at once, and it held. He did not go to his father the king in a rage. He did not accuse Cassius in open court, where the counterstory would have been waiting, where it would have become the heir's word against the consorts, a family brawl the old king would have flinched from. He did none of the things that could be turned into the ambitious son, slandering his stepbrother. Instead, he moved exactly as the household's own procedure required, using the enemy's own machinery against them, which is the only truly unanswerable move. There was to be a trial of the clerk Petrel for embezzlement. The consort's people had arranged it, wanting the matter formally closed with the clerk convicted. Rowan let it proceed. He did not obstruct it. He simply exercised the Crown Prince's ancient and unquestionable right to preside over a household tribunal in the king's name, a right no steward could deny him without insulting the throne itself, and he took the seat of judgment at Petrel's trial. And he had the seized ledger, the household's own evidence, entered by the prosecution, brought into the hall and laid open on the table of judgment, where it belonged. The enemy walked into that hall certain of victory. They had built the case. They controlled it. The clerk was broken and would confess. The Lord was untouched. They did not understand until it was far too late that they had brought the murder weapon into the courtroom and handed it to the one man who knew where the fingerprints were. I was in that hall. I had made certain of it, a guardsman of the eastern posts, standing the wall of the tribunal chamber, furniture again, watching. And I watched the whole thing come apart. The tribunal chamber was a cold stone room with a high seat for the one who judged, and a long table for the evidence, and a rail where the accused stood. Old King Alaric was present, seated to one side beneath the arms of Harrowgate, gray and tired and grieved, there because a matter touching his grandson's injury could not proceed without him, but plainly wishing to be anywhere else. The Queen Consort Morwenna sat near him, still and handsome and cold, in the confident stillness of a woman watching a play whose ending she has already written. Lord Cassius stood among the household officers at his ease, a faint impatience on his smooth face, a man attending the tidying up of an inconvenience. Lady Verena watched from behind her mother, saying nothing, missing nothing. And at the rail stood poor Petrel, gray and shrunken and shaking, a man already half convicted in his own bowed shoulders. The Crown Prince Rowan took the high seat. He was very calm. I had wondered in the days before whether his fury would show, whether the father in him, learning who had rotted the frame his son fell from, would burn through the judge. It did not. He was cold and level as I have ever seen a man, and I understood that this was the deepest anger of all, the anger that has decided exactly what it will do and will not spend one drop of itself before the moment. The consort's steward, acting for the prosecution, laid out the case with practiced smoothness. The training frame had failed and injured Prince Torin. Investigation had revealed the frame's spring repair to be fraudulent coin drawn for work never done, the legs left to rot beneath false bracing. Responsibility for the work's accounts lay with the office of the clerk of works. The clerk Petrel had falsified the entry, embezzled the coin, and left a child to be hurt by his greed. The evidence was the seized ledger itself, in the clerk's own keeping, in the clerk's own hand. The prosecution asked for the clerk's conviction and the matter's close. It was, as I said, a masterwork. Every word of it was true except the one that mattered. The clerk falsified the entry, and that one lie was buried so deep in true facts that no one in that hall was expected to dig for it. "The evidence is the ledger," Rowan said, his first words mild. "Then let us examine the evidence. Bring it here to me." A small pause. The steward had meant the ledger to be referred to, cited, its conclusion accepted, not opened and read line by the judge himself. But there was no way to refuse the presiding prince his own sight of the entered evidence without an insult to the throne, and so the great book was carried up and laid open before Rowan on the high seat's table. "Clerk Petrel," Rowan said, "you are accused of falsifying the work order for the spring repair of the training apparatus. Show me that entry." Petrel's shaking hands turned the pages. He found the line. He could hardly have failed to, he had lived on it. He set his finger there and could not speak. Rowan looked down at the page for a long moment. Then he read aloud in that level voice, filling the cold room. "The work order for the spring repair of the royal training apparatus, timber, iron, and labor, a sum drawn against the household works account." He paused. "Recorded, entered by the clerk of works Petrel, as is his office." Another pause, and now something changed in the room's air, a first cold breath of it, though most did not yet feel it. "And authorized, ordered the coin placed in charge, the completed work signed as done by the officer of the works." "By whose hand, clerk?" "Read me the mark of authorization. Read me the name that ordered this repair and signed it complete." The whole hall was silent. The steward had gone very still. The consort's stillness had changed its quality entirely. No longer the calm of a woman watching her own play, but the terrible frozen stillness of one who has just seen a wrong page turned and cannot stop the reading. And Lord Cassius, for the first time, was no longer at his ease. Petrel raised his eyes not to the consort, not to Cassius, but to Rowan, to the one man in that room who had asked him for the truth and offered to carry it. And in a voice that shook but did not break, the small, frightened clerk at last said the thing he had been sick with for weeks. "The mark of authorization is not mine, Your Highness. I only recorded what was given me, signed and approved, as is my office." The work was ordered, the coin drawn, and the labor signed complete by the officer in charge of the household works. His finger moved on the page, from his own recording line to the line above it, the line of the signature. "By Lord Cassius. This is his hand and his seal. I have never in my life ordered a repair or drawn a coin against the works. I have no power to. I only enter what the officer approves." And this he approved and signed done, and the frame was never mended, and the young prince fell. I have stood in some loud rooms. I have never heard a silence like the one that fell in that hall. Rowan did not raise his voice. He turned the ledger slowly, so that its open page faced the room, faced his father the king, faced the household, and he set his own finger beside the signature, and he said, "Lord Cassius, is this your hand?" And Cassius, who had walked into that hall certain of victory, made the mistake that guilty men make when the ground opens under them too fast. He reached for the first lie within grasp, instead of the silence that might have saved him. That is a common formality," he said, and his smooth voice had a crack in it now. "Officers sign 100 such orders. I could not possibly inspect every repair myself. If the work was done badly, that is the fault of the men hired to do it, or of the clerk who oversaw the coin." "The clerk does not oversee the coin," Rowan said. "You have just heard him say so. You have just heard your own prosecution's own witness on your own evidence testify that the clerk cannot draw a coin, that only the authorizing officer can. That officer is you. You ordered the repair. You took charge of the coin. You signed the work complete." He let each fact fall like a stone laid in a wall. "The repair was not done. The coin is gone, and you signed it complete. Where is the difference, Lord Cassius, between the coin drawn for that repair and the coin spent upon it? For the timber was never bought, and the men were never paid to do the work, and yet the full sum left the account under your signature. Where did it go?" Cassius had no answer. There was no answer. It was the oldest fraud in the world, and it had been laid bare in the plainest possible terms, out of the enemy's own mouth, on the enemy's own evidence, before the king himself. It was then that the Queen Consort rose. I had wondered whether she would. A wiser strategist might have stayed frozen and let her son sink alone, salvaging what she could from the wreck. But Morwenna had spent years believing that her weight, applied firmly enough, could bend any room in Harrogate to the shape she chose, and she reached for that weight now, as she had reached for it at a sick child's bedside. "This is monstrous," she said, and her voice was made to carry, and it carried. "A tribunal called to try a thieving clerk, turned by the Crown Prince into an attack upon my son, upon this family, before the king himself. A single line in a ledger and a broken clerk's word to save his own neck, and on that you would disgrace a lord of this house. My son signs 100 orders. The clerk had the keeping of the accounts. The clerk is the thief. The clerk will say anything now to shift his guilt upward onto a better man. This is not justice. This is the Crown Prince using his dead mother's grief, and his son's hurt as a ladder to strike at those he has always resented. I will not sit and sit down." It was not Rowan who said it. It was the king. Old Alaric had risen from his seat beside her. He was gray and he was tired, and he was, everyone in that hall knew, a man who had for years declined to see what his wife did in his house, because seeing it would have meant knowing what his grief had led into his life. But he was still the king, and there is a thing that wakes even in a tired old lion when the matter set before him is the deliberate rotting of the frame his grandson rode, and a good servant caged for it, and a child taught to disbelieve his own pain. Alaric had heard the whole of it now. And whatever willful blindness had carried him this far, it could not carry him past a work order signed by his wife's son over the body of his son's son. "Sit down, Morwenna," the old king said, and his voice shook, but not with weakness. "I have listened." I have listened to all of it, and I have listened, I think, to rather too much for rather too many years, and told myself it was peace. He turned from her. He did not look at her again. He looked at his son on the high seat, at the open ledger, at the shaking clerk, and last of all at the wall of the hall where a certain guardsman stood at attention. "Rowan, you have the seat of judgment. Judge." The consort sank back into her chair. The weight had failed her at last in the one room where it mattered, and she knew it, and her handsome cold face was, for the first time in all my years of watching her, the face of someone who has lost. And the Crown Prince Rowan took action. He did it in the joiner's way. Each piece fitted true, and it held. "Lord Cassius," he said, "you are relieved of the office of the household works and of every office of this house, effective at this hour, and the accounts of the works for these several years past will be examined line by a commission of the king's honest men, not the household stewards, the king's men, that we may learn how many other repairs were signed complete and never done, and how much of this house's coin has gone into your purse, and what else in these walls has been left to rot under your false bracing. You will answer for all of it before the law. Your title and your liberty are the king's to weigh when the reckoning is complete. Until it is, you are confined to your apartments under guard, and you will touch no account and no ledger and no coin of this house again." Cassius opened his mouth and closed it and said nothing, because there was nothing, and two guardsmen of the household, good men, honest men, men I knew, stepped up on either side of him at the prince's nod and took him quietly from the hall. He did not go the way he had come in. No one who saw both would have called it the same man. "The clerk Petrel," Rowan went on, and his voice gentled a degree, "is cleared of every charge. He recorded what his office required him to record, and when he understood what the record meant, he did not, as a corrupt man would have, destroy it. He kept it. It is because he kept the true line and did not burn it as others burned the frame, that this fraud stands exposed and this house can be made clean. He is not a thief. He is the honest man who preserved the evidence that convicts the thief, at the risk of his own place and his own neck. He is restored to his office with the king's thanks, and let it be known through this house that the clerk of works told the truth when the truth was dangerous, which is more than can be said of far greater men in these walls." Petrel stood at the rail and wept openly, the shameless weeping of a man who has carried a stone too long and felt it lifted, and no one in that hall thought the less of him for it. I thought the more. "And the stable hand." Rowan's voice changed again, and I heard in it, under the judge, the father. "Odo of the stables, who has served this house since before my own children were born, who checked a girth that never slipped, who caught my son in his arms when the frame gave way and held him and comforted him while others ran. That man was seized and caged and slandered as careless, not because anyone believed him careless, but because he was a convenient curtain to hang before a lord's fraud. He is released this hour, cleared wholly, his name restored before the whole house, and he will hear from my own mouth what this house owes him. No man will ever again say in Harrogate that Odo was careless with a royal child. The truth is the reverse. He was the only grown man in that yard who did his duty perfectly, and he has paid for it with weeks in a cold cell, and this house will make what amends a house can make." The tribunal closed. The false story, built so carefully over the true one like stone over a spring, had cracked from top to bottom, and the water had come up at last. I would like to tell you that I stood there glowing with vindication. I did not. I stood at the wall furniture, and I watched a good clerk weep and a cold woman lose and a guilty lord led away, and what I mostly felt was tired, the deep clean tiredness of a thing long carried and finally set down. I had broken my oath of silence exactly once in 11 years, in a frost-white orchard at dawn, and it had been worth it, and I would do it again, and I hoped I would never have to. They let Odo out that same evening. I was there when the gatehouse door opened, and the big gentle man came up the steps into the last of the light, blinking, thinner, older, a blanket around his shoulders that someone had thought to give him. There was a small crowd. Word travels in a palace faster than any order, and when Odo came up into the yard, the grooms and the kitchen folk and half the lower household were there, and they did not cheer exactly. It was quieter and better than a cheer. They simply gathered around him and touched him and said his name, the way you welcome home someone you had feared was lost. He stood in the middle of it looking dazed and humble and undestroyed, and when he found my face at the edge of the crowd, he did not smile so much as ease the way a beam eases when the false load is taken off it, and he came through them all and stood in front of me. You said whatever you could, he said, and no more. I found the joint, I said, which meant nothing to him, and he did not ask. He only put one of those great loaf hands on my shoulder once and let it lie there a moment and then took it away, and that was all the thanks either of us needed or wanted. We are not, neither of us, men of many words. It is why we understood each other. The Crown Prince kept his promise about the amends, and kept it well, but that is a longer story than this one and belongs to Odo, not to me. I will say only that the stable hand ended his years not caged and forgotten but honored, with a cottage and a pension and the free run of the stables he loved, and that when he died, years on, the Crown Prince, king by then, came to the burying, and stood at the graveside with the working folk, bareheaded, and said a few plain true words about a man who did his duty perfectly in a yard full of people who did not. I was there for that too. I am glad I lived to see it. Lord Cassius was stripped and confined, and the commission of the king's honest men went through the works accounts line by line as Rowan had ordered, and found, as I had guessed they would, that the rotten training frame was not the crime but the accident that exposed the crime, that years of repairs had been signed complete and never done, coin drawn and pocketed, the house's own bones left to soften under false bracing while its officer grew rich. He answered for it before the law. His mother's weight could not save him from it, for she had spent the last of that weight rising in the tribunal hall, and it had failed her before the king. And after that day, the Queen Consort was a diminished thing at Harrowgate, watched now and doubted, and no longer able to make a story true simply by saying it in a carrying voice. That, I think, was the deepest justice of all, not that she was punished, for she was too clever and too well married to be easily punished, but that she lost the one power she had truly wielded, the power to be believed. And Prince Torin. That is the part I most wanted to set right, and the part that took longest, and the part I am gladdest of. For a bone knits in weeks, but a child taught to disbelieve his own memory does not mend so fast. Torin had been made to feel, by weeks of gentle cold correction, that the one true thing he knew, the frame broke, I felt it break under me, was a confusion, a fault in himself, a thing he must not trouble to remember. And the tribunal undid that in an hour. For the whole house learned, and Torin learned, that he had been right, that his memory had been true all along. That the frame had broken under him exactly as he felt it break, and that the grown people who told him otherwise had been lying to protect a thief, and that his own honest child's memory of his own body had been, in the end, the truest witness in all of Harrowgate. I was on the corridor watched the day the Crown Prince told him. I did not hear all of it, but I heard Rowan say, low and clear, "You told the truth, Torin. From the first, you said the frame broke, and it did, and everyone who told you otherwise was wrong, and some of them knew they were wrong. You are not to doubt yourself again. When you know a true thing, you hold it, even when great people tell you to let it go. Do you understand me, especially then?" And I heard the boy, careful, clever, 11, say, in a voice with the flatness gone out of it and something whole coming back, "I held it as long as I could. Then I got tired." "I know," his father said. "Someone held it the rest of the way for you. That is what we are for. I have thought about that a great deal in the years since. That is what we are for. The Crown Prince meant himself and his house, and the duty of the strong to hold the truth for those too small to hold it alone. But I have come to think it is what I am for too, in my smaller way. A guardsman is a still man at a wall, and the world walks past and forgets he has ears. but a still man who keeps an honest ledger and pays his debts, and does not force the joint but waits until he can fit it true. That man can, once or twice in a long service, hold up a thing that would otherwise fall, until the right hand comes to take the weight. I went back to the eastern posts. I stood my watches. The orchard walk frosted and thawed and frosted again, and the Crown Prince walked it alone with his dead, and passed me at dawn, and never spoke of it, and neither did I. There was no need. We had each done the thing that was ours to do. But sometimes, on the cold mornings when he passed, he would tilt his head a fraction toward the eastern wall, the smallest motion, nothing anyone else would ever see, and I would come to attention a half-breath sharper than the drill requires. And that was the whole of it. Two men who had held up a true thing together, saying nothing, at dawn in the frost. It was enough. It was more than enough. A false story had been laid over the truth like stone over a spring, and we had cracked the stone, and the water had come up, and a good man walked free, and a boy kept his own memory, and the rot in the house's bones was cut out at last. That is a great deal for one still man at a wall to have had a hand in. I have never asked for more, and I have never needed to. The truth came up. That was the wage. It was the only one I ever wanted.